So let's talk about India's big environmental puzzle. It's a real head scratcher. The official data says the country's getting greener, right? More trees, more forests. Sounds great. But if you look at what's actually happening on the ground, you get a completely different picture. And it all starts with one single, really big number. So here it is, 29,000 hectares. Just try to picture that for a second. It's a huge area. And this number, it's a record. But it's not the kind of record anyone should be proud of. It's a number that tells a story of loss, of something vital disappearing. Because that 29,000 hectares is the amount of forest land cleared, wiped out for things like mines, dams, and massive highways. And get this, it happened in just 1 year. That's the highest it's been in a decade. We're talking about an area bigger than a lot of cities, just gone. So it really makes you wonder, right? How is this possible? If India's total forest cover is officially increasing, how can so much natural forest be disappearing at the same time? Well, to get to the bottom of this paradox, we have to look at how these massive projects are actually getting built. It often comes down to, well, let's call them creative interpretations of the law. And there is no better example of this than a mega project unfolding in the Himalayas. All right, so we're heading into the Himalayas. The project is called the Char Dham Highway. It's this massive 900-kilometer road network that's being built to connect 4 really important Hindu pilgrimage sites. It's a huge deal, a flagship project for the government, but it's also ground zero for this huge clash between faith, national security, and, you guessed it, the environment.
Okay, so before we go further, you need to know about this key piece of Indian law. It's called an Environmental Impact Assessment, or EIA for short. Basically, it's supposed to be a brake pedal, a mandatory safety check. Before you can build some massive project, you have to do one of these assessments to figure out, what kind of damage it's going to do to the environment.
So you have this crucial safety check, right? Well, here's where it gets interesting. The law is very specific. Any highway project longer than 100 kilometers needs an EIA. The Char Dham Highway? It's 900 kilometers long. So what do? Well, you don't treat it as one giant project. Instead, the project was chopped up into 53 separate, smaller segments. And wouldn't you know it, every single one of those segments was just under the 100-kilometer limit. By doing that, they neatly sidestepped the need for a single comprehensive review of the total environmental damage. Pretty clever, huh? And the fallout from dodging that full assessment? It was devastating. And it was fast. We're talking about a fragile Himalayan ecosystem here. Over 50,000 trees were cut down. Debris from the construction was just dumped illegally into rivers, choking them. The slopes of the mountains themselves were destabilized. And tragically, this led to an increased risk of landslides, some of them fatal. Experts who were actually on the ground watching this happen were screaming that the whole idea was backwards. The founder of Vedatam, Siddharth Agarwal, put it perfectly. He said, if you have such destabilized roads, a wider road is not making you more secure. A more stable road is what will make you more secure. And stability is the one thing this project just wasn't delivering. Okay, so it's easy to look at the Char Dham Highway and think, wow, that's one bad project. But here's the thing, it's not an isolated incident. Not at all. It's actually a symptom of a much bigger trend. What we're seeing is a systematic effort to actually rewrite the rules of the game, to change the country's core environmental laws to make projects like this easier to push through. And you can see this shift crystal clear when you look at the Forest Conservation Act. The original law from 1980 was a game changer. It put serious brakes on deforestation by requiring central government approval for pretty much everything. But fast forward to 2023, a new amendment comes in, and suddenly there are massive exemptions. It says that strategic linear projects within 100 kilometers of international borders don't need forest clearance anymore. And where are those borders? Exactly. They're in places like the Himalayas, some of the most ecologically sensitive areas in the entire country. And it's not just that one amendment. These changes are all working together. They're literally narrowing the definition of what even counts as a forest. They're proposing to cut down the time the public has to weigh in on these projects. They're even floating ideas to legitimize projects that started building without permission in the first place. The whole point, the stated goal of all this, is to fast-track what they call the ease of doing business. And the way they're doing it is by lowering one environmental hurdle after another. Conservationists like Bitu Sagal, who's the editor of Sanctuary Asia magazine, are warning that this is a huge mistake. He says, India's planners do not realize or accept that nature-based capital has a greater value than any human capital. In other words, this entire approach treats nature as something to be cashed in for short-term profit, instead of what it really is, the fundamental capital that supports all life. Okay, so this brings us right back to where we started, back to that paradox. With all these rules being changed and forests being cleared, how on earth can the official numbers claim India is getting greener? Well, the answer is a bit of a statistical magic trick. It all hangs on one simple but incredibly important question. What exactly is a forest?
So if you just look at the headline numbers, everything seems fine. The official reports will show you this chart. And yeah, it shows a net gain in total forest and tree cover over the last couple of decades, a little over 1%. On paper, you'd look at that and think, hey, that's pretty good. We're winning. But here's the catch. It's all in the definition. The term forest cover in these reports is, well, it's incredibly broad. It doesn't just mean a beautiful ancient jungle teeming with wildlife. No, it also includes commercial plantations. Think rows and rows of palm oil trees or eucalyptus. It even includes fruit orchards. Ecologically, those things are worlds apart from a natural forest, but on the books, they're counted in the same column.
So when you actually break it down, you see what's really going on. Look at this. We are losing our most precious forests, the really dense, natural ones. At the same time, we're seeing a gain in what's called open forest and plantations. So the loss of the good stuff is being hidden or masked by the gain of this other ecologically poor stuff. It's like tearing down an old historic building and replacing it with a parking lot, and then saying you've had a net gain in structures. It just doesn't make sense.
And this isn't just an academic distinction. This trade-off has huge real-world consequences. We're talking about losing massive carbon sinks. These forests store something like 7 billion tons of carbon. We're talking about shattering wildlife corridors and losing native species. We're increasing the risk of landslides and floods because these natural forests are what hold the soil together. And maybe most importantly, we're talking about the human cost, the displacement of forest communities who have lived in these areas for generations.
So in the end, what we're seeing is a redefinition of what development even means. As India races toward economic growth, a clear pattern has emerged. You take irreplaceable natural capital, you clear it away, and then you obscure that loss with a very convenient, very broad definition of what green is. And it leaves us with a really tough question. When natural capital is spent for economic capital, when you trade a real forest for a number on a spreadsheet, who actually profits from that deal, and who is ultimately left to pay the price?